I woke up to my phone buzzing at 5 in the morning with a motion alert from my front gate. And when I opened the security camera app, I saw my own father standing on my property with a locksmith, a realtor, and my brother Caleb, all of them plotting to break into the ranch I'd bought with my own money and somehow sell it out from under me. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Through the grainy footage, I could see my dad gesturing toward my house like he owned it, like the deed with my name on it meant nothing. The locksmith was already kneeling at the gate lock with his tools spread out on the frozen ground. The realtor had a clipboard. They weren't there to visit, they were there to take. I'd driven 2 hours through a Montana blizzard 3 months ago just to be told I wasn't welcome at Christmas dinner. My own father had sent me a group text saying the holiday would be for immediate family only. And when I'd called to ask what that meant, my stepmother Sarah had explained in her sweetest voice that it would be better if I stayed away this year, that it wasn't personal. Except it was the most personal thing anyone had ever done to me, so I'd made a decision that night, sitting alone in a roadside diner with a slice of pecan pie I couldn't taste. If my family didn't want me at their table, I'd build my own. I'd bought Blackwood Ridge Ranch 3 weeks later, 40 acres of Montana wilderness with a worn barn and a sturdy house that needed work, but had good bones. The property was mine, legally and completely. My name was on every document. And now they were trying to steal it. I threw on my coat and boots, my Marine training kicking in as I calculated response time and tactical advantage. This was my land, my future. And I wasn't about to let anyone take it, not even the man who was supposed to protect me. This is going to be a long story, and I'm going to need someone to witness what happened next. If you want to hear how this nightmare unfolded and how I finally took back control, follow these stories so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happened when I confronted them at that gate changed everything. The text message had come 3 days before Christmas while I was at the hardware store in Billings, picking up supplies to winterize the cabin I was renting at the time. My phone lit up with a group message from my dad, and I remember smiling because I thought it was about coordinating what dishes everyone would bring to dinner. We'd done Christmas together every year of my life, even when I was deployed overseas and could only video call from a tent in Iraq. The message said the dinner would be intimate this year, just the core family, and that everyone already knew the plan. I'd read it 3 times, waiting for the part where he explained what he meant, but that was it. No follow-up, no clarification. I'd texted back asking if he meant I should come earlier or later, and the silence that followed felt like falling through ice. When Sarah finally responded 12 hours later, her message was clinical and cold. She'd said it would be better for everyone if I sat this one out, that they needed time to focus on Caleb's recovery, and my presence might complicate things. She'd added that I shouldn't take it personally, as if being uninvited from Christmas by your own father was just a scheduling conflict. I'd tried calling. My dad let it go to voicemail. Caleb didn't even open my messages. It was like I'd been erased from the family group chat and the family itself in one swift, silent decision. I'd spent that Christmas Eve at a truck stop off Route 93, drinking bad coffee and eating pie that tasted like sawdust. The waitress had wished me happy holidays with tired eyes, and I'd almost started crying right there at the counter. Instead, I'd opened my laptop and started searching for land. If I couldn't belong to their family, I'd build something that belonged completely to me. That's when I found Blackwood Ridge Ranch. It was a foreclosure listing. 40 acres of raw Montana land with a small house and a barn that had seen better days. The previous buyer had lost their financing at the last minute, which meant the bank was motivated to close fast. I'd saved almost everything from my deployments, living on base and sending money home whenever Dad or Caleb needed help. I had enough to buy it outright. Cash deal, no mortgage. I'd called the realtor from that truck stop parking lot, my breath fogging in the cold air, and made an offer that night. Within 2 weeks, I was signing papers. Within 3, I was moving my things into a house that had my name, and only my name, on the deed. The day I got the keys, I'd driven out to the property alone. The house was small but solid, with wood floors that creaked and windows that looked out over rolling hills that disappeared into pine forest. The barn needed repairs, but the land was mine. Every frozen acre of it. I'd stood in the empty living room, running my hand along the windowsill, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Or maybe just the absence of waiting for the next rejection. But that peace didn't last long. The sheriff showed up on my 3rd day at the ranch, his cruiser rolling up the long gravel drive like he had all the time in the world. I'd been hauling boxes from my truck, still in my old Marine PT gear, and I'd instinctively straightened up when I saw the badge. His name was Wyatt Miller, and he was maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of Montana winters. He'd introduced himself with a firm handshake and said he liked to know who was living on the old Miller property, which apparently his grandfather had sold off generations ago. He'd looked at me with the kind of recognition that came from spotting another person who'd served, and told me he'd been Army himself back in the day. We'd talked for a while about the land, about the winters, about how the barn would need work before the heavy snows came. Then he'd said something that stuck with me, his voice dropping into a more serious tone. He'd told me to protect my perimeter. That land had a way of bringing out the best and worst in families, and that I should keep my documents locked up tight and my security solid. I'd thanked him, thinking it was just general advice for a woman living alone on a remote property. I'd even joked that I'd faced worse than rural Montana during my deployments. He hadn't smiled. He'd just tipped his hat and told me to call him if I ever needed anything, then handed me his card with his personal cell number written on the back. I'd installed security cameras that same week. Motion sensors on the gate, cameras covering the driveway and the front porch, all linked to an app on my phone. I'd told myself it was just good sense, that I was being practical. I didn't think I'd actually need them, not really. Not for what came next. I'd been settling in, learning the rhythms of the property, when I got a strange call from the county clerk's office. A woman with a nasal voice had asked me to confirm that I was aware of a title dispute on my property, and my stomach had dropped. I'd told her there was no dispute, that I'd bought the ranch free and clear, and she'd sounded confused, saying someone had called claiming to be a family member contesting the sale. I'd asked who. She'd said she couldn't release that information, but recommended I contact a lawyer. I'd hung up and immediately called Madison Reed, my old JAG mentor from my time in the service. Madison had transferred to a civilian firm but still took my calls, and when I'd explained the situation, she'd gone silent for a long moment before telling me to send her every document I had. 2 days later, she'd called back and told me the inquiry had come from a real estate office in Billings. Someone had been asking questions about my property, trying to find out if the sale could be reversed or if there were any loopholes in the deed transfer. Madison had said it smelled like a setup, like someone was testing the waters to see if they could make a claim. I'd asked her who would do that. She'd said the most obvious answer was family, especially if they felt entitled to the property for some reason. That night, I'd lain awake in my new house, listening to the wind rattling the windows, and wondered if my father knew I'd bought the ranch that Caleb had supposedly wanted. I'd wondered if the Christmas exclusion had been about more than just family drama. I'd fallen asleep with my phone on the nightstand, the security app open, not knowing that in less than a week, that app would show me exactly how far my family was willing to go. When that motion alert went off at 5 in the morning, I'd already been half awake, my body still trained to respond to danger even years after leaving the service. I'd grabbed my phone and opened the camera feed, expecting to see a deer or maybe a coyote. Instead, I'd seen 4 people standing at my locked gate in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the cold air. My father, my brother Caleb, my stepmother Sarah, and 2 men I didn't recognize. One in a puffy jacket holding a clipboard, the other kneeling at the lock with a toolbox. I'd listened to the audio feed, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My father's voice had come through tinny but clear, telling the locksmith that I wasn't really living there, that I'd bought the property just to spite Caleb, and that this ranch was supposed to be my brother's new start. The realtor, because that's clearly what the man with the clipboard was, had asked if my father was sure about the legal standing, and Dad had waved him off, saying it was a family matter and the deed would be transferred once they got inside. I'd called Wyatt Miller before I'd even gotten out of bed, my voice shaking with rage. I'd told him what was happening, that my family was trying to break into my property with a locksmith and a realtor, and that they were planning to sell my ranch. He'd said he was 10 minutes away and to stay on the line. Then I'd called Madison, waking her up on the other side of the state. She'd answered after 2 rings, her voice sharp with concern, and when I'd explained, she told me she was already getting dressed and would be there in 3 hours. She'd said not to let them inside, not to sign anything, and to record everything. I'd thrown on my coat and boots, not bothering with anything else, and walked out into the freezing morning. The snow crunched under my feet like breaking glass, and I'd felt every muscle in my body coil with the kind of focus I used to have on patrol. this was my home, my land, and they were trespassing. By the time I'd reached the gate, the locksmith had the lock disengaged and was pulling it open. My father had looked up and seen me, and the expression on his face was something between shock and anger, like I was the one who wasn't supposed to be there. I'd asked him what he thought he was doing, keeping my voice level and cold. He'd stammered something about needing to talk to me, but the presence of the locksmith and realtor told a different story. Caleb had stepped forward then, his face red with something that looked like embarrassment, but sounded like entitlement when he spoke. He'd said I knew he'd had plans for this property, that he'd been trying to buy it for months, and that I'd swooped in and stolen it out from under him just to prove some point about being better than everyone else. I'd asked him when he'd planned to mention these grand plans, considering he hadn't spoken to me in over a year. He'd said I should have known, that families should support each other, and that I'd always acted like I was above them just because I'd served. Sarah had touched my father's arm then, her voice taking on that syrupy concern she always used when she wanted to seem reasonable. She'd said they were just trying to help Caleb get back on his feet, that he needed this opportunity, and that I already had a good career and benefits and didn't really need a ranch. I'd looked at my father then, really looked at him, and asked if he seriously thought I'd just hand over the deed to a property I'd bought with my own money because Caleb needed a fresh start. I'd asked if he remembered that I was the one who'd paid for Caleb's rehab twice, who'd sent money when Dad lost his job, who'd shown up every single time they needed something. Dad had said that's what family did. They helped each other. And I'd said that's exactly what I thought too, right up until I got uninvited from Christmas and then found them trying to break into my home. The realtor had started backing away then, clearly realizing this wasn't the simple family transfer he'd been told about. The locksmith had packed up his tools without a word. That's when I'd heard the sirens. Wyatt's cruiser came up the drive with lights flashing, throwing red and blue across the snow. Behind him was another vehicle, a black SUV that I didn't recognize until Madison stepped out in her sharp business suit, a leather briefcase in her hand. She'd made it in under 3 hours, which meant she'd been speeding the entire way. My father had immediately tried to explain to Wyatt that this was a family misunderstanding, that he was just trying to help his son, and that I was being unreasonable about a property that should have gone to Caleb in the first place. His voice had that pleading quality he used when he was trying to charm his way out of trouble, the same tone he'd used with bill collectors and landlords over the years. Wyatt hadn't been charmed. He'd asked my father if he had any ownership documents for the property, any legal claim at all. When Dad had hesitated, Wyatt had turned to the locksmith and asked if he'd been hired to break into private property. The locksmith had said he'd been told it was a family estate issue and had left immediately, his van disappearing down the road. The realtor had tried to explain that he'd been contacted by someone claiming to have power of attorney over the property, that he'd been shown some documents that suggested the sale was under dispute. Madison had asked to see those documents, and when he'd pulled them from his clipboard, she'd scanned them with the kind of cold precision that made me remember why she'd been so good at her job. She'd told him the documents were fabricated, that the signatures were forged, and that he'd been used as an unwitting accomplice to attempted theft. She'd handed him her card and told him to contact her office if he wanted to avoid being named in the criminal complaint she was preparing. He'd left so fast he forgot his clipboard on the ground. Madison had then turned to my father and laid out exactly what was going to happen. She'd explained that she had the original deed, the bank's sale documents, the title insurance, and every piece of paperwork proving I was the sole legal owner of Blackwood Ridge Ranch. She'd said that any attempt to contest the sale, forge documents, or harass me further would result in criminal charges for fraud, attempted theft, and trespassing. Caleb had tried to interrupt, saying they weren't trying to steal anything, that he'd just wanted what should have been his. Madison had cut him off and asked if he'd ever made an offer on the property. He'd admitted he'd tried but couldn't get financing. She'd asked if he'd informed me of his interest before I bought it. He'd gone silent. She'd said that losing out on a property you can't afford isn't theft. It's called the free market, and that showing up with a locksmith was called breaking and entering. My father had finally lost his composure then, his voice rising as he'd said I'd always been selfish, that I joined the Marines just to get away from them, and that I was rubbing my success in their faces by buying the one property Caleb had wanted. He'd said I'd never understood what it was like to struggle, to watch opportunities slip away, to feel like a failure in your own family. I'd stayed quiet through all of it, watching him unravel. I'd learned in the service that sometimes the best response was silence, letting the other person talk themselves into a corner. When he'd finally stopped, breathing hard and looking older than I'd ever seen him, I'd spoken for the first time since Wyatt arrived. I'd said I understood struggle better than he knew. I'd understood it every time I'd wired money home from a combat zone. I'd understood it every time I'd worked double shifts to cover his rent. I'd understood it every Christmas I'd spent away from home while he and Caleb had sat around a table I'd helped pay for. And I'd understood it most when he'd told me I wasn't family enough to join them for the holidays, but I was family enough to bankroll Caleb's fresh start. Sarah had finally spoken then, her voice losing that sweet coating. She'd said I was twisting things, that they'd just been trying to give Caleb a chance, and that I was holding grudges over nothing. She'd said the Christmas thing had been her idea, that she'd thought it would be better to have a small gathering while Caleb was still fragile, and that I was making it into something it wasn't. Wyatt had held up his hand then, stopping the argument before it could spiral further. He'd said he had enough on his camera to file a report, and that if anyone showed up on my property again without permission, they'd be arrested. He'd looked directly at my father and said that included family, especially family. They'd left without another word, Sarah practically dragging my father to their truck while Caleb lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just followed them down the drive, and I'd watched until their taillights disappeared into the dawn. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every word that had been said and every word that hadn't been. Madison had put a hand on my shoulder and told me she'd file a restraining order if I wanted one, but I'd shaken my head. I'd said I just wanted them to leave me alone. Wyatt had stayed for another hour, filling out paperwork and telling me about a private investigator he knew if I wanted to find out what else they'd been planning. He'd said families got messy over land, but this was worse than most. When they'd both finally left, I'd walked back into my house and locked the door behind me. The sun was coming up, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. My ranch, my home, still mine. But the victory felt hollow because I was standing in it alone. 3 days after the confrontation, I'd gotten a call from Madison. She'd been doing some digging into Caleb's finances, trying to understand why my father had been so desperate to hand him my property. What she'd found had explained everything and nothing at the same time. Caleb was in debt. Not just normal debt, the kind of debt that came with threatening phone calls and dangerous people. He'd borrowed money from someone connected to a construction outfit in Billings, promising he'd flip the Blackwood Ridge property for a massive profit. When the bank had denied his loan application, he'd still been on the hook for the money he'd already borrowed against the imaginary sale. Madison had found bank statements showing my father had co-signed on some of Caleb's loans, which meant Dad was liable too if Caleb couldn't pay. She'd found text messages between Sarah and a real estate lawyer asking about adverse possession and deed transfers. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe months, building a strategy to take the property by claiming some kind of family entitlement or proving I wasn't actually living there. The Christmas exclusion hadn't been about family dynamics or Caleb's recovery. It had been about cutting me out, making it easier to claim I'd abandoned the family and didn't deserve to be part of family decisions. It had been calculated and cruel, and knowing that somehow made it worse. I'd asked Madison if we should press charges, and she'd said it was up to me. The fraud wasn't successful, so prosecution would be complicated and expensive. But she'd already filed a cease and desist, sent copies to the county clerk, and made sure every relevant office knew that any documents related to my property needed to be verified with her first. I'd spend the next week working on the ranch, throwing myself into physical labor because it was easier than thinking. I'd repaired fence posts, cleared brush, started demolishing the interior walls that needed to go. Every swing of the hammer felt like breaking something open inside me. The private investigator Wyatt had recommended had sent me a report that confirmed what Madison had found and added more details. Caleb had been meeting with the realtor for months, showing him the property like it was already his, promising a quick sale for development. The locksmith had been hired through a third party to avoid direct connection to my family. Sarah had been the one coordinating everything, sending emails from an anonymous account. My father had gone along with it because he was desperate and because Sarah had convinced him I wouldn't really care about the ranch, that I'd eventually give it up anyway. She'd told him I was just acting out over Christmas, being dramatic, and that once I calmed down I'd understand they were just trying to help Caleb. The investigator's report had included something else too, a recording of a voicemail Caleb had left for the realtor 2 days before they'd shown up at my gate. In it, Caleb had sounded scared, talking about people who were pressuring him, saying he needed to close the deal immediately, or things would get bad. His voice had been shaking, and despite everything, I'd felt a pang of concern. He was still my brother, and he was in over his head. I'd sat on my porch that night, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, and thought about all the times I'd bailed him out before. The first rehab stay when he was 23, after he'd crashed his car and almost died. The second one 3 years later when he'd relapsed. The credit card debt I'd paid off. The rent I'd covered. Every time I'd told myself I was helping family, that this time would be different. But it never was. And now he'd tried to take the one thing that was completely mine. I'd made a decision then, sitting under the Montana stars. I wasn't going to press charges. I wasn't going to demand restitution, but I also wasn't going to fix this for him. Caleb needed to face the consequences of his choices without me as a safety net. My father needed to understand that love didn't mean endless tolerance, and Sarah needed to learn that I wasn't the pushover she thought I was. The next morning, I'd gotten a text from a number I didn't recognize. It had said Caleb wanted to meet, that he needed to talk to me alone, and that he understood if I said no. I'd stared at that message for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let him drown in the mess he'd made. But another part of me, the part that remembered pushing him on swings and helping him with homework, wanted to hear what he had to say. I'd told him he could come to the ranch, but only during daylight, and only if he came alone. I'd also told him I'd be recording everything. He'd agreed. Caleb had shown up 3 days later, driving a beat-up truck that looked like it barely made the trip. He'd parked at the end of the driveway and walked up to where I was sitting on the porch steps, not trying to come closer until I'd nodded that it was okay. He'd looked terrible, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervousness that made him seem younger than his years. When he'd sat down on the bottom step, keeping distance between us, he'd started crying before he'd even said a word. He'd told me he was sorry, and it had come out in a rush of words that tumbled over each other. He'd explained about the debt, about the people he owed money to, about how he'd made promises based on a property he'd never actually secured. He'd said he'd convinced himself it should have been his, that the bank had made a mistake denying his loan, and that, if I hadn't bought it, he would have found another way. I'd asked him why he thought he deserved it more than me. He'd been quiet for a long time before answering, and when he did, his voice had been small and ashamed. He'd said because I had my life together, because I'd succeeded at everything I'd tried, and because he was tired of being the failure while I was the hero everyone admired. I'd told him I wasn't a hero, that I was just someone who'd made different choices. I'd reminded him of all the times I'd helped him, not to throw it in his face, but to ask why he thought I owed him even more. He'd said he never thought about it that way, that Dad and Sarah had convinced him I was being selfish, that I'd bought the ranch just to hurt him. He'd admitted he'd been desperate enough to believe it, because it was easier than facing the fact that he'd messed up his own opportunities. I'd asked him what he planned to do about the debt. He'd said he was trying to work it out, that he'd gotten a job and was making payments, but it wasn't enough. The people he owed wanted their money immediately, and they weren't patient. He'd said he was afraid, and I'd believed him because I'd heard that fear in soldiers' voices before, the kind that came from knowing you were trapped. I'd made a decision then that I knew I might regret, but I'd made it anyway. I'd told Caleb I'd give him one more chance, but it wouldn't be money. I'd said I'd co-sign a personal loan from my credit union, enough to pay off the dangerous debt, but only if he went to financial counseling and only if he cut ties with anyone who'd gotten him into this mess. I'd said I'd also require monthly check-ins with proof of payments, and if he missed even one, the deal was off and he'd owe me directly. He'd looked at me like I'd offered him a lifeline, which I suppose I had, but I'd been clear. This was the last time. After this, we were either going to have a real relationship based on honesty and respect, or we weren't going to have one at all. He'd agreed, still crying, and told me he didn't deserve my help. I'd said he probably didn't, but I was choosing to give it anyway, because I wanted to believe people could change. I'd also said that if he ever tried to take advantage of me again, I wouldn't just cut him off. I'd make sure everyone knew exactly what he'd done. Before he'd left, he'd asked if he could hug me. I'd hesitated, then nodded. It had been awkward and brief, but it was the first time in years that we'd touched without anger between us. As he'd driven away, I'd felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of it, or at least the willingness to see if it was possible. 2 weeks later, Caleb had brought me the paperwork showing he'd paid off the debt and started counseling sessions. He'd also brought something else, a letter from our father. Dad's letter had been handwritten on yellow legal paper, his messy scrawl covering 3 full pages. I'd read it sitting at my kitchen table with coffee going cold in front of me, and with every paragraph I'd felt anger and sadness, and a strange kind of relief all mixed together. He'd admitted that Sarah had pushed him to help Caleb take the ranch, that she'd convinced him it was the only way to save our family from financial ruin. He'd said he'd felt like a failure as a father, unable to help his son succeed, and that he'd projected that failure onto me. He'd written that he'd been jealous of my independence, resentful that I'd built a life without needing him, and ashamed that his other child couldn't do the same. He'd said the Christmas exclusion had been his idea, not Sarah's, because he'd thought if he pushed me away, it would hurt less when I inevitably cut him off for what they were planning. He'd said he'd expected me to hate him afterward, that he'd deserved it, and that he was sorry for being too much of a coward to face me directly. He'd ended the letter by saying he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but that he hoped someday I might let him try to be the father he should have been all along. I'd folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I hadn't been ready to respond, and I'd told Caleb to let Dad know I'd received it, but needed time. Caleb had understood, and he'd kept his word about the check-ins, showing up once a month with paperwork and stories about his progress. Months had passed. I'd finished the major renovations on the house, built new stalls in the barn, and bought 2 horses that I'd always wanted. The ranch had started to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. My father had called on my birthday, 6 months after everything had happened. I'd let it go to voicemail, then listened to it 3 times. He'd sounded old and tired, saying he just wanted to wish me well and tell me he was proud of me. He'd said he was going to therapy, trying to work through his own issues, and that he hoped I was happy. I'd thought about calling back, but I hadn't been ready. Last Christmas, I'd made the decision to host my own dinner at the ranch. I'd invited Caleb, who'd brought his new girlfriend and stayed sober the entire time. I'd invited Wyatt and his wife, who'd become good friends over the year. I'd invited Madison, who'd driven out from her family celebration just to stop by with wine and stories. And I'd invited my father. He hadn't come, but he'd sent a text saying he respected my boundaries and appreciated the invitation. He'd said maybe next year, if I was willing. Sarah hadn't been invited, and I'd been clear with Dad that she never would be. Some bridges were too burned to rebuild. Sitting at my table that Christmas, surrounded by people who'd earned their place there, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in years. I'd felt chosen, not by blood, but by mutual respect and genuine care. I'd built a family that didn't require me to sacrifice my dignity or my safety, and that was worth more than any genetic connection. I'd learned that forgiveness didn't mean opening your door to be hurt again. It meant acknowledging the past without letting it dictate your future. It meant setting boundaries that protected your peace, even if those boundaries disappointed people you loved. It meant understanding that you could wish someone well from a distance without inviting them back into your space. My father called me last week. We talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had in over a year. He'd asked about the horses, about the barn renovations, about whether I was happy. I'd answered honestly, and at the end, he'd asked if he could visit in the spring, maybe help with some of the fencing work. I'd told him I'd think about it. And I meant it. This story isn't about perfect endings or fairy tale reconciliations. It's about learning that the people who matter most are the ones who respect your worth, not the ones who share your DNA. It's about building a life that belongs to you, on land that has your name on the deed and boundaries that you get to define. I'm standing on my porch right now, looking out over Blackwood Ridge Ranch with morning coffee in my hand and snow on the mountains in the distance. This is mine, these 40 acres, this peace, this hard-won understanding that family is a privilege you grant, not an obligation you endure. If you're listening to this from wherever you are in the world, I want you to know something. You deserve a seat at a table where you're valued. And if that table doesn't exist yet, you have every right to build your own. Drop a comment and let me know what city you're listening from. I'd love to know this story reached you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, about real people taking back their power and building lives on their own terms, make sure you follow this channel. because everyone deserves to know they're not alone in fighting for the dignity they deserve. Thank you for listening. This is my story, and I'm still writing it every single day.